تغيرات كبيرة وهائلة، وربما هذا ما أشار له المسؤولون العسكريون.
The United States is in a state of security and surprise.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı. Ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello and welcome to Varn Blog, and today I'm with Spencer Leonard, who is the author of a book coming out on, a co-author of a book coming out on Marxism in India, and also the editor and principal annotator of some collections coming out of Marx's and Engels' journalism. And we're going to be talking about your volume that you've selected between 1851 and 1859, which is mostly journalism on imperialism, Bonapartism, the beginnings of the national question, etc., and so forth. I found your introduction to the selected volume incredibly useful.
I'm glad.
Almost as a rejoinder to a lot of the kind of what I like to call the new theory of Marx on the back of a napkin scholarship that a lot of people do off of Mega 2 research, which is I think become popularized in the United States by people's reception of translations of Michael Heinrich. To a lesser degree, the work of Tarcel and Musto. And I found the recontextualization somewhat interesting. You focus almost solely on journalism in this volume. And while it's interesting because I think Marxist journalism often gets shoved off as, except for a few key pieces, as not as important as the rest of his work. And you argue pretty compellingly that this is probably unwise and also was not historically true for the first, for the founders of Marxism, the First International, or the thinkers in Second International. So would you like to go into why we need to look at this journalism more closely and maybe why it hasn't been looked at closely?
Sure. And thanks for that introduction. Obviously there are things that are more important than Marx's journalism written outside of the context of the socialist workers movement. The things that Marx wrote under his own editorship for his own newspapers, things that he wrote with sympathetic publishers like the 18th Brumaire, which was published by his close comrade Joseph Wedemeyer in New York City. Things that he had full editorial control over, I would place as the most important works to base any interpretation of Karl Marx's thought and politics on. In other words, what I'm excluding there is manuscript material, right? I think that we should pay attention to the stuff that Karl Marx wrote and published. Now, the stuff that I'm talking about, he published, but he published it, in a context of, extreme poverty. He was writing for money. He was this is the job that Marx had in exile before Engels made his money. You always hear, Engels supported Marx, and maybe that's the only reason why they were such good friends, which is all crap. Marx helped to support Engels at times. It was and when it rained, when it finally rained, it poured. In the sense that there were a series of financial windfalls for Marx in the 1860s that set him up in independence. His family inheritance, money from Wilhelm Wolff, their comrade, as well as Engels's, coming into his fortune and selling off Hermann and Engels his share in that, which he helped to pension Marx for life. So in the 1850s, these men were poor. And I'm looking at Marx's journalism that is primarily in English. He wrote it in English. And there is no doubt that sometimes the editors in the American newspaper, it was the New York Tribune, it was a Republican newspaper, it had a mass circulation national edition that was weekly, that was sent all around the country. So people like Abraham Lincoln in Illinois almost certainly read Marx in that edition as Republicans. That material was sometimes bowdlerized by his editors, and it's just clear because sometimes it's completely clear because they will make it appear as if, for instance, he is an editor of the Tribune. They will turn his writings into their editorials, which Marx didn't appreciate. They would run without attribution to him, in other words, and they would be made to sound as if they were the voice of the New York editors. And other more subtle instances that of course puzzle 20th century scholars, but the overwhelming reality, in fact, is that it is similar or identical to the pieces that appeared, for instance, in the Chartist press. There are sometimes pieces that Marx published that he wrote for the New York Tribune, and he also published with the Chartist press, the People's paper, for instance, under the editorship of Ernst Jones, who he was working very closely with, and he was in the editorial offices of the weekly of the People's paper, and so he did have editorial control there, and so it's very clear that these are important writings, and these are or they're writings by Karl Marx, whether they're important or not. Now, what is the reason substantively why they're important? I try to set up in that introduction a kind of false and dichotomy between Marx's political and revolutionary writings and his political economic writings. And everybody knows that Marx is a revolutionary. From 1848 until 1851, his writings are purely political, from the Communist Manifesto to the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. What happened to those concerns and the arc of development in his political thinking, which I argue is the crucial transformation in Marx and Engels' thinking, is a result of experience, the experience of that revolution, apart from the insights that they'd already come to as young men. Those themes, most obviously the theme of Bonapartism or imperialism, seems, or we are told, you can read Marxology, Marx scholarship, and come away believing that they do not reappear until 20 years later when Marx writes The Civil War in France. Which is very largely a retrospective account of the empire in France. And my argument is, no, these political concerns are suffusing the whole of Marx and Engels' writings, including the Capital Project or the Critique of Political Economy project. But that's a larger discussion. They never leave Marx's concerns. They're absolutely central, and that in that sense, Marx is a thinker of class independence, of the party question, and of the critique of democracy after 1848 to the end of his life. And so that's the way I pitched it to the publisher. That was my sort of book proposal argument, that this was these writings are important to connect the concerns of Marx and Engels across the decade of the 1850s into the formation of the First International, where, of course, there is a certain kind of political engagement, obviously, and to the writing of the Grundrisse, the contribution to the critique of political economy, and the first drafts of Capital in the 1860s. Yeah.
So there's a couple of things that I take away from that. One, and this unfortunately is a trend in scholarship, not just in Marx, which is as a field of research kind of overly matures, you have a tendency to look for novel interpretations by looking at manuscript evidence and prioritizing manuscript evidence over formally published and approved. And what makes this interesting to me is these are not unproblematic in that schema, like, because they're not pure Marx, they have editorial interventions. But they were published, and sometimes under his name, and that means they should be given some priority in your interpretive heuristic here, right? So clear, self-edited stuff that we know, bam, stamp on.
Yep.
We got it. All right. Now there are some texts that I would put pretty high priority that were not published, like Critique of the Goethe Program, but the reasons why those were not published are known and explained by Engels. Like and Engels felt they were important enough to publish actually during his lifetime. So it's interesting. Why do you think this? Because there's two kinds of trends in Marx scholarship that you have to contend with. One is this kind of general academic trend towards novelty, and the other is the fact that even though some of these volumes are not bad, some of the Soviet and Chinese volumes are not bad volumes of Marx stuff. I mean, I own some Progress Publisher stuff somewhere.
Absolutely.
They have agendas, and they're also organized according to those agendas that can change the way you read the work. I think in your introduction, you point out like that most of these, for example, when journalism is put in, say, a Progress Publishers or a foreign language press book, they're put in like a volume on X national question, geographically bound and sent out, not on topic beyond that or on time period. Although they probably are, I think they are chronologically ordered when you get those.
Go ahead. If I may, I obviously, Marx is a little bit of a different animal because he's the founder of Marxism, which is a strange phenomenon, and it's not like liberalism or something like that. It's after the thing's named after the guy, right? And people conduct political debates, by throwing quotes of Marx at each other in Marxism. And so, there's a tussle over Marx and his writings, absolutely, in a way that I would argue is pretty distinct. There are returns to Marx that punctuate the history of the left. And I'm arguing that, the most, and obviously all of that is, I would say originarily and and still inescapably framed by the so-called revisionist dispute.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So you get into this question of orthodoxy, right? Which, no other political thinking has exactly those dynamics in relationship to a particular figure. You don't have to be, an orthodox, Lockean, to be a liberal, for instance. So, I argue in the text, in the introductory pieces that, we don't escape the debate of orthodoxy except at an interpretive price. That, in other words, the question of his context, of understanding him in his time, of how he developed, of what the arc of the development is it driven by, just ongoing reflection, like a scholar we might say his thought just derives from, the time in the library, or does it change in response to events and to shifting currents within socialism? All of those questions, which any scholar might address, are handled at a very high level in political debates that actually had stakes, in a weird sort of way, right? That the struggle for orthodoxy within Marxism is a struggle for revolutionary socialism. And that's a very bizarre kind of phenomenon that takes place, but it is, and so for instance, I talk about how the very impulse to edit and publish all of Marx's writings is a direct outgrowth of the October Revolution. And, and figures like, David Ryazanov, the founder of the Marx Engels Institute. Mm-hmm. And so the case of this journalism is strange. We know this, probably, we are children of the new left intellectually. Anybody, I know anyone you talk to about Marx knows, for instance, Althusser, right? We know the framing that's coming out of the new left. That was also a struggle. That was also involved a return to Marx. So works like the Grundrisse, mm-hmm. or the economic and philosophical manuscripts. The critique of the Gotha program was more important, in the originally consequential revisionist dispute, like when Lenin's arguing with Marx to overthrow the provisional government in State and Revolution. But in the 50s and 60s, you get these, texts that Marcuse picks up, that Sartre picks up, that others pick up. They don't really deal with the journalism, right? So those Stalinist editions that you were talking about, on colonialism, on Britain, on the U.S. Civil War, that are thankfully published by international publishers. God bless them. Those editions were cheap and they were nice paperbacks, and I bought them and read them and learned a load from them. But they are misleading, in the sense that, Marx didn't have thoughts about Britain that were like different from his thoughts about America. He was thinking about the age of capitalism, of capital. He was thinking it, in a sense, in terms of historical time, most fundamentally, rather than geography. And so those texts are misleading in that way. And, but what I argue there is, they were never really taken up by the New Left. The only people who read them, I'm as you may know, I'm a historian of South Asia by training. And in Indian communism, they know the writings on India.
Right.
For sure. And those are probably some of the most famous worldwide. But, they're never taken up in like the disputes intellectually over within the New Left about recovering socialism and recovering Marx in the way that, my professor, Moïse Pastone, would highlight absolutely the significance of the Grundrisse, right? For mounting a new Marx that was adequate to the critique of communism and social democracy and, high 20th century capitalist society. So these texts, and, so the gambit that in the books is, basically to say, well, what would orthodoxy say about these things? Or can orthodoxy deal with these things? And I say, well, absolutely, because for orthodoxy, Bonapartism is an absolutely crucial category, and Bonapartism is just a synonym for imperialism. It is, it's the specific as opposed to the general. Their concern was about revolutionary Marxism, about the struggle for the dictatorship of the proletariat, and thus the revolutionary overthrow of the state by proletarian socialist forces, organized workers led by a party or parties. Why is any of that necessary? Because the state is not class neutral. The state is a Bonapartist state. It's an imperialist state. And its very existence is a kind of negative of it registers, the imperial state registers the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat. It's democracy managing capitalism in the absence of the proletariat being prepared to, as it were, take responsibility for it. Right. And so that's what I'm trying to say, is that like this issue about Marx and imperialism, it goes absolutely to the heart of, the debates with, with Bernstein and Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin and Trotsky, right? These are not, of course, I'm just selecting Marx and putting the evidence in front of my reader. These are great reads, whether people agree with the way I frame it or not. But I'm arguing that, look, Marxism framed Marx for us in a way that actually rose to the level of history itself, right? It's like not like a scholar's debate. And so, I know about Marcelo Musto, and I know about all of these modern thinkers, and you'll notice that I just kind of, say, well, let's let Lenin and Trotsky and Rosa Luxemburg tell us, let's let the great scholars speak. Kautsky.
I think there's an interesting tension there, because we all are children of the new left, whether we want to be or not, just like we're children of the U.S. socialist left because we're in the United States, and that history actually, because of the new left, is obscured to us. But
yes,
I'm also thinking about how, like, for example, today, if you tried out the debate on imperialism, and you, even when you get fairly orthodox answers, no one's going to trace them back to Marx. You're going to get them traced back to Lenin or Bukharin, or Stalin, or maybe Luxemburg, but without the Marx context. Like, and I actually find I find this helpful. That's one of the things I find most helpful about this, because the way sometimes it's taught now post New Left is like the national question emerged. Marx had a few things to say on it, but not a lot, because we're not reading the journalism. Here's some letters that were not published, and then okay, now we're gonna get into like the Kautsky, Luxemburg, Lenin debates, are all the debates around the Second International and the emergence of the Comintern, and it seems as if it is almost taught as if these emerged later and they weren't really a concern of Marx at all. So I want to dig down into the category of Bonapartism. I think the one contention that you've made that's going to be controversial, even amongst people who consider themselves fairly orthodox, is going to be that Bonapartism is the specific instantiation of imperialism. So can you go into more about what that means and where you find that in Marx?
It's just like everything else in Marx. When you dig into it, you find out, he didn't come up with this.
Mm-hmm.
All of his best lines, he's just taking from the liberals and the socialists. It's, the discussion of Bonapartism and imperialism were just the way that it was discussed. There was a nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte named Louis Bonaparte, who was first elected president in 1848, in December of 1848, in the first election held under the Constitution, formed by the provisional government. And then, of course, he staged a coup d'etat rather than step down, which he was going to have to do. And he did it in the name, of course, of the will of the people. And so, he did it, on the anniversary of his uncle's accession to emperor, which was also the date of his victory at Austerlitz. The invocation of Bonapartist, of the First Empire, was explicit, and people saw it as concentrated in France, but not confined to it. And you'll find that really is just in the newspapers at the time. And so Marx is just taking up this category critically. He's not inventing it. He's saying, what is the significance of the repetition of the course of the last and greatest of the classical bourgeois revolutions, the Great French Revolution. And we all know, how he opens his discussion in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, where he says first time is tragedy, second time is farce, the difference between bourgeois revolution and proletarian revolution, etc. Right? We have to learn our poetry from the future. All of those, wonderful one-liners there in the opening riff. It's all about the repetition of bourgeois revolution under conditions of capital, right? Which means that the revolution will take on a mass democratic character, and that mass democracy itself becomes the terrain that the proletarian revolution has to navigate. And that's going to be a very murky, almost mythologically fantastical, as he will later say, fetishistic, like we're in the old religious metaphysics, right? This is a whole new world, right? The example he uses in the 18th Brumaire is the story of Hercules' labor in defeating the Titan. I think his name is Antaeus, who he keeps. Who's a great wrestler because he's the son of the earth, and every time he gets thrown to the ground, he rises up stronger because his mother strengthens him. right? And this is the image that Marx gives of the proletarian revolution, that every time it throws its opponent to the ground, it rises up with greater strength. And of course, in the myth, Hercules ends up holding him up in the air and breaking him, so to defeat him. And that's the passage that leads to the famous phrase, until conditions themselves cry out, hic Rhodus, hic salta. Right. And Marx there is talking about, the way in which, we're going to demand bourgeois society. We're going to demand jobs. We're going to demand that the workers be put to work. We're going to demand democracy. And that's exactly how socialism will be defeated. Right. That it's the discontents that ultimately socialism will take up in democracy that are capitalism's greatest resource for its political reconstitution, right? And so it's the thought in around this question of Bonapartism and why you get the word Bonapartism does get a kind of a different semantic range, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the ways you'll get it is Bonapartist politics. You don't really hear imperialist politics except to simply mean like jingoistic appeals to militarism. But Bonapartist politics, really is the basis for Marxism thinking about capitalist politics. What kind of thing is it? Because Louis Bonaparte was a socialist, right? That's he's a socialist and he's a Democrat. He overthrows the government because the government of the Second Republic is trying to limit universal suffrage. And so in defense of universal suffrage and against the nasty bourgeoisie that shot down the workers in the June days, right? The socialist emperor is, the socialist president is going to ascend to his destiny as emperor, and he's going to proceed to implement all kinds of socialist policies, which he does. All sorts of ways in which the state is involved with capital and is, public works projects to put workers to work, to begin, building the rudiments of what we might call the welfare state in France, is exactly the imperial program. Because, and he hires Saint-Simonians to basically set up French finance, all of that, right? And so it's about how, that story for Marx is about how socialism is translated into capitalist policies through democracy. I hope I didn't go on too long.
No, it's actually very useful. And I am often bad about gauging what my audience already knows. So it's good to start with that. One of the things I think I want to ask, though, is there are lots of discussions contemporaneously on Bonapartism, and there are lots of discussions on imperialism, right? But post-1960s, post-Maoist, post-Trotskyist split, and I do put the asterisk when the Trotskyists start to split is when this sees, not in classical Trotskyism.
Repeat what you just said, Derick. I'm sorry.
Okay. So
I want to follow your question exactly.
So post-Maoism's arrival as a separate, distinct form of anti-revisionism in the late 50s and 60s, particularly in France and America, post the Trotskyist splits in England and the United States, you don't see the discussion of Bonapartism being tied into imperialism. There's a Bonapartist discussion and there's an imperialist discussion, but rarely the twain shall meet. Why do you think that happens at that time period? Because I'm trying to get people to understand how that informs our discussion today.
It's a very complicated story, and I'd like to write a book about it. It's a monster. So on the one hand, you have, so the theory of Bonapartism is ultimately an epochal theory. That's what I'm arguing. For Marx and Engels, this is not, and this is, this is already going to be counterintuitive for a lot of people. Right? A lot of people run around with notions like, oh, this is a liberal democratic state. Right? America's a liberal democratic country, or France is a liberal democratic country, this sort of thing. For Marx and Engels, liberal democratic signals a contradiction. Right, because what the democracy is going to demand is a curtailing of liberalism. Right, the old bourgeois rights are going to generate bourgeois society itself is self-contradictory, and so you can't just say liberal democratic. That this is a progressivist concept. It is not a Marxist concept. So for Marx and Engels, and later Marxism, Second International Marxism, all capitalist politics is imperialist. And that is true even if that country doesn't have overseas dominion anywhere. So for instance, the German Empire would be understood as imperialist. It confesses it, after all, under Bismarck, even though it's not it's not Britain, or to a lesser degree France, with all sorts of overseas colonies. Now it is also the case that Marx and Engels don't call the movements or even the government that they like Bonapartist. I'll give you an example that I think is the most acute example in their time, and it's actually where I end the books, which is the American Civil War. The American Civil War, the Union, they're not going to say that the Union is Bonapartist. They're going to say the Confederacy is Bonapartist. Of course, it's actually being supported by Louis Bonaparte's France and Palmerston's England. And it is, manifestly reactionary. But the only reason they don't call it Bonapartist is because they think it is generating, they think the Republican Revolution of 1860 that elects Abraham Lincoln has open-ended possibilities up to and including world socialist revolution. Right? So they see Lincoln as it were, just a stage in a potential unfolding of a revolution that will ultimately encircle the world. And of course, they're right about that happens in a meaningful way. It's not a world socialist revolution, but it culminates in Reconstruction. It culminates in the Paris Commune. It culminates in it culminates in the Second Great Reform Bill in England. It culminates in a wave of democratic and liberal revolution, anti-slavery above all. So it is a political slur, Bonapartist, but it really does mean all the capitalist politics of the epoch. And so, but in the 20th century, when Trotsky is criticizing the Soviet Union, he revives the language of Bonapartism, or he continues that language. He also uses a very confusing or a very different language or unusual language of Thermidor,
right?
In The Revolution Betrayed and Elsewhere. But the overarching figure is Bonapartism, right? And which is not exactly the state capitalist thesis, and not exactly any of the Trotskyist positions, but it opens into them. And in that era, The Stalinist view is that no, there's a workers' state, and then there are the liberal democracies.
Mhm.
And especially that's confirmed after the Pop Front period, in the period of the People's War line of during World War II, where the only countries that are Bonapartists are the fascists, right? And so after the Second World War, that is the usage on the left. To talk about Bonapartism is to talk it's like when people talk about the authoritarian state or something. They mean like it's on the way to fascism, but maybe we don't want to use the F word yet. It's distinguished from liberal democracy. That's a legacy of the 30s and 40s. Now,
okay,
right now, imperialism becomes about colonialism. Right. So the whole unity of the concept is disintegrated, right? Because the most manifest expression of imperialism for Marx and Engels would be like the cops, right? That's why you can talk about like Germany as an empire, right? It's about the power of the state in society, domestically. Right, managing the contradictions of capitalism. Now that has an overseas, dimension, especially in England, where the army is, right? The British army's in the colonies, and the British don't like standing armies, even though they developed the police in the 1830s and 40s under Sir Robert Peel. That's why they're called bobbies. And so the rise of the cops, the rise of the state of bodies of armed men, placing society under armed occupation domestically, coincides with the rise of the proletariat, right? For Marx and Engels. And so for them, imperialism is crucially, like capitalism itself, concentrated in the metropole. And then it's only when you, in a sense, understand the dynamics at the heart of capital can you understand the world system and the world state. Now, fast forward to the October Revolution. It's after the defeat of the German Revolution, which is a kind of extension of the October Revolution. I know you're very familiar with this history. The defeat of the Spartacus uprising in 1919, and the meeting of the second, which is really practically speaking, the first Congress of the Comintern in 1920. There you get the debate over the colonial and national theses between Lenin and an Indian named Manindranath Roy. Who had been a nationalist kind of terrorist and becomes a socialist. He's the founder of the Mexican Communist Party, and he becomes important in advising the Chinese communists to defeat in the 1920s. Roy and Lenin are debating the role of colonial movements, most obviously the rise of Gandhian mass nationalism, after World War I, and how does it play into socialism? And the whole point of that is, for Lenin, is that it's in the wake of defeat. He's talking about a strategy of retreat, right? And he's saying, well, in a context of retreat, we can still gain support and advance our position by supporting anti-imperialist movements in the colonial world, even though they're not going to be led. There are no proletarian parties there. There are no that's why there are no delegates from parties here. But of course, China especially generates a communist party very quickly. India a little bit later in the 1920s. It's a strategy of retreat that ultimately becomes the whole purpose of communism globally, which is to say, by the time of the Vietnam War, the sponsoring of decolonization is sort of the only point of communism. It's what it's what the tankies still like about it, right? Is that it was down with Ho Chi Minh, it was down with like fuck the white man, it was but the anti-imperialist question in like India and China was always tied to the question of, yes, a new strategy in the wake of our defeat in 1917 to 1919. We've gotten this far, but now we're going to have to climb back down the mountain and find another way up, to use Lenin's metaphor. And in that moment of retreat, we're facing the rise of anti-imperialist movements in India, Indonesia, and China. There will be more in the future. How do we relate to them? But it's still a question of proletarian revolution in the core of capitalism for Lenin and for Trotsky, right? Orthodox Marxism is about the overthrow of capitalism in the core of capitalism, goddammit, right? And it becomes about decolonization. And decolonization is, of course, therefore, dressed up as a revolution, which it just isn't anywhere. It's a negotiation between elites everywhere in the world. There's nowhere in the world, maybe in Vietnam, that you could say that the masters of the universe, the leaders of global capitalism, really resisted militarily decolonization, right? In any fundamental way. It's, in India, which is overwhelmingly the most important case, it's a gentleman's agreement. I mean, yes, there's a mass movement, but in the end, the British walk away with very few shots fired. There's the Amritsar massacre and, many other, unforgivable instances of state violence, but it's not fought tooth and nail. And in Vietnam, where it is fought, the French and the Americans have a major constituency amongst the Vietnamese people in South Vietnam, and there's no denying that. It's in that sense, they're taking part in the Vietnamese Civil War. So I just said a mouthful there, Derick, but I'm trying to show like these categories get pulled apart and then betrayed in two different directions.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly useful. And I'm also thinking how foreign this is going to sound to contemporary politics now. I mean, one of the things I find interesting about this is that we really do have to see the development of anti-colonialism in the context of the Cold War, in the context of a negotiated agreement between what is developing bourgeois powers and developed bourgeois powers, and not in the context of, well, I mean, one of the things that I always talk about with Maoism and specifically is of the historical traditions, the one that I know a ton about, but also can't tell you what it actually is. All right, because there's so many doctrines that emerged between 1950 and 1971 or 1978, right, that they're completely mutually incompatible. Even like three worlds theory can't even be made compatible with contemporary third worldism because one of the worlds in the first world doesn't even exist anymore. And so right, this seems to break the brain of a lot of people in the sense that they almost become like this tradition almost becomes an empty signifier. Like, I don't know anything. And this also becomes increasingly true of Trotskyists. And in the 1920s and 30s, I know what Trotskyism means, and I know where the key disputes are. By the 1980s, someone calling themselves a Trotskyist can have such an array of politics that it's non-descriptive. It's not just not predictive to global geopolitical and economic events. It's not predictive to an individual's actual political stance. So this key tracing it back to this decoupling of Bonapartism, which is really a debate with a kind of movement away from, ironically, during the anti-revisionist debates, a movement away from what the terms originally mean, make this very, 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 very muddled. And it also makes it where you can start to arbitrarily attach, quote, anti-imperial signifiers, not even to a self-professed socialist state like the USSR, but to any state that is not in, well, some of them, to say they're not in the Western liberal democratic sphere, is not even true. So it's kind of,
after all, France was anti-imperialist in the lead up to the Gulf War.
Right,
I mean,
exactly.
and the lead up to the Iraq War, right? They were disputing, the presence of WMDs in the Security Council.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, and there's a Gaullist tradition of muddling that line while also pursuing explicitly colonial aims in Africa. But
far more nakedly than the United States does, pretty much anywhere except maybe Panama.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Amusingly, actually, also, when people talk about this, they often link France as those interests are just a proxy of the U.S. But when you actually trace what they're doing, the U.S. doesn't benefit from it at all,
and often opposes them.
Right.
Not just in the Suez Crisis. I mean, there are major differences over Algeria, et cetera.
Right. Even differences over interests in Senegal and stuff. It's kind of lost in this idea that also the liberal democratic states are all somehow acting in concert with each other, and by in concert they mean subjugated by the U.S., which is, put it frankly, not true. And I think people have what's interesting about this is this has material consequences. I want people to understand this. It's not just something that is an abstract academic debate. Like, this affects all sorts of foreign policy of the USSR. It affects how the USSR disentangled and disintegrated. It affects a lot of the modern left's justifications. And one of the things that we have to deal with, I think, when we talk about the new left, is the proliferation of academic theories that, for example, use this language. And a big one, for example, I think of as world systems theory. Now, I think there's some good scholarship that comes out of some of those historians, but when Wallerstein says something like capitalism was never progressive for human society at all, which he did say towards the end of his life, people are not picking up that it's a fundamental rejection of Marxism. In fact, they take it as a statement of Marxism, which even someone like me, it drives me wild. Like, it's like, well, so you're literally saying that feudal societies were better than capitalism,
right?
For what reason? How do you justify that?
Can I just pick up on a couple threads there?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how old you are, Derick, but you're younger than me. I was 30 years old at the time of 9/11, and
we're almost exactly 10 years apart.
Right. And so, I was, it was like, the Yugoslavian Civil War was for me, the war on terror was for you. Mm-hmm. I was not fully equipped, and you may have been a more precocious young person. I was not fully equipped to begin to think through the world. I was very much a student. I studied and I learned a lot from the best. I studied with Habermas, and I studied with Rorty, and I studied with Pistone throughout the 1990s. There was no experience really, except this like rad lib world. I remember being like recruited by the ISO, and they were like, dangling their prettiest members in front of me. And acting like we were going to go for coffee or on a date. And it was all just weird. And after 9/11, of course, there emerged a worldwide movement around imperialism. And as you know, in that time, was also for me, a kind of years of gestating what became core ideas of the Platypus Affiliated Society, which I was involved in, sort of in a proto way, as very close friends with Chris Catrone. And we were in very close dialogue with Moise Pastone, and lots of arguments. This book is, to me, about that early phase. It's a response to those early debates about imperialism that I remember from like 2004, 5, 6, 7, 8. And it, of course, it gestated through the period through the aftermath of Occupy and the Podemos Syriza moment, leading into, of course, ultimately Sanders and Corbyn.
Right.
Which, and this is the problem with, quite frankly, the Jacobin story about the left, right? The recent history of the left is what they're missing when they say that the mass socialist left, or the left of your generation forms around Bernie Sanders, is they're missing that trajectory from 2005, 6, 7 to 2013, 14, where you went from this anti-imperialism and this very strong, of course, dialogue with the new left, which were still around and vital. They're not so much now. They are aging. People who really had the experience of the 1960s. But the party question developed. Right? The party question was formulating around talking about Podemos and Syriza, et cetera, right? There was a ground laying after, there were lots of debates, and I can point to all of them after Occupy, after the discontent with Obama, and you saw it also elsewhere in the world, right? And it's the connection of those two, working through these things, right? Working through this horrible muddle of the 20th century legacy that you were just, very ably discussing, particularly with reference to Maoism, but other currents, right? Which you faced as a 20-year-old, I faced as a 30-year-old at the dawn of the 21st century, right? This, accumulation of defeat and confusion and ideology that on the left. And so, this was, these books are my attempt, this approach to Marx, it is coming out of this experience of the 21st century, right? Of trying to go back and learn for our time what, I think you can learn a lot. In fact, I think you have to self-consciously navigate the new left's Karl Marx.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't do that, it sucks. It may suck, but these are complicated matters for intellectuals. I hate to say it, they just are. If you want to figure it out, you can't just pick up Althusser or pick up Sartre or Andre Gortz or Moise Pastone or anybody else or me. You have to think it out for yourself, and you're going to have to read. And that's why I present it as a selection of Marx's own writings. You have to reconstruct this history for ourselves in our time, and you still won't know what to do with it, right? But, it's, if you're claiming these warrants, right? If you think, that you're part of this tradition, especially now, we find, you discover that that tradition can only be inherited as problems and questions. It is never going to come to you as answers. If it did have the answers, we wouldn't be here in this fucking situation. Right. So that's, I don't know if, that, another way of getting to what you were saying is, and this is very constitutive of the way that I think about it. And I would refer your listeners to what I think was a really excellent conversation between you and Reed Kane on this podcast, which was ostensibly, it's about the Hegel-Marx relationship and like the philosophy, Marx and philosophy and all of that. But what it's really about, and you guys, I think make it clear, is it's about the question of Marx and and really socialism to the bourgeois revolution, right? What Hegel means is just the French Revolution. That's right. That's what that word means. Just as Adam Smith means socialism and Ricardo means socialism for Marx, right? It's about it's in the sense that even the project of socialism is coming out of the bourgeois revolution, and the early socialists are inspired by Adam Smith and David Ricardo to think societyism, right? And so a lot of what I'm trying to say about Bonapartism and imperialism is simply to say that Marx is a theorist of the crisis of that bourgeois revolution. Its trajectory is one of the subjugation of the state to society. That is the goal of the bourgeois revolutions, right? For them, and you can see it in, the Abbé Sieyès or Thomas Paine. Take your revolutionary, pick your bourgeois revolutionary pamphlet. The goal, the idea is that the state are like foreigners, or they're a separate caste. They have put society under armed occupation. Their taxes are arbitrary. It's arbitrary power. Their taxes aren't taxes, they're tribute from a productive society to an unproductive military caste. And the univocal voice of the bourgeois revolution from the 17th century to Hegel is one of the subordination of the state to society, so that the laws come increasingly to express the lived moral community of society, right? And what Marx is saying is that under conditions of capitalism, the project of freedom that the bourgeois revolution is about, Hegel's project, all of their project, Thomas Jefferson's project, Thomas Paine's project, Benjamin Franklin's project, Robespierre's project, all of them, is come into crisis. It's contradictory. Workers getting a job and participating in civil society and becoming independent of all feudal bonds and creating the grounds for their individuality in society is creating systemic unemployment, lumpenization, etc. That's what that's what Marx calls the proletarianization of labor. In that context, the state is reemerging to manage the symptoms of that proletarianization, which look like crime and corruption and drug addiction and widespread prostitution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All the morbid symptoms of capitalism, which the cops are both there to alleviate and reproduce, right? Mm-hmm. That's what it's about. It's, in other words, it's not a Marxist theory. It's a Marxist self-consciousness of the crisis of the only project of freedom there is, the one that we're still engaged in, the bourgeois revolution. Right? That socialists are trying to inherit the bourgeois revolution as labor, in other words, as the third estate, and they're trying to advance it, and their very success is going to deepen the problem because it's going to drive forward industrialization. It's going to drive forward the contradictions. It's going to draw the state in. This is why Marx is constantly talking about the factory inspectors in Capital, right? And what are they, right? He's talking about socialism and the worker struggle itself generating the state, and the state expressing and being caught up in those contradictions, right, of its society. So that, is a kind of, I guess I would say that, viewing it that way, which is the way I've come to view it, I think is very much in the Marxist tradition. I think it's very orthodox. People can dispute that with me. But what it isn't is the idea that Marxism is another way of thinking about the world. Right? That it's like there are liberals who think about the world this way, and there are Marxists who think about the world that way. Right? Marxism is always there to say to the liberal, okay, yeah, I agree with that. And then what? And then what? And then what? Right? I'm listening to you about political economy. I'm listening to you to Adam Smith, David Ricardo. Let's talk about that commodity form. Let's complete that project. Right? And what is the critique of bourgeois thought? What is the critique of liberalism? It's the self-consciousness of its self-contradiction. Right? In other words, if you put it, I know that you're a reader of Capital, if you put it in those terms, you can't determine whether Marx is the scientist who completes the science of political economy, or whether he's the dialectical, magician who, shows how the categories are self-contradictory. Because the science, the completion of political economy is the demonstration that the society is self-contradictory. It's the same thing, right? So to say that like Marx is coming out of liberalism is to say that he's a thinker of its crisis, and that the project of socialism can only be conceived as the realization of all the goals of liberalism, plus this like utterly unspecifiable part, which is the socialist part, the world beyond labor, or the abolition of the commodity form. Like, these things that I talked to Doug Lane about, and he's like, well, we have to abolish the commodity form. And I'm like, yeah, how the fuck do you put that on a placard and you raise that as a slogan? Like, what does that mean? Like, of course, we're going to overcome capitalist labor, but that's not something that can be politically enacted, right?
Yeah.
All that you can do is open up the potential for the socialist revolution, for the people to make that revolution, right? That is totally beyond any kind of project of, that is what the dictatorship of the proletariat is meant to open up as a potential. Right.
No, yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, and I've been thinking about it for 10 years, is the fact that while elements of liberalism you can find going all the way back to antique society, but capitalism was not pre-forma thought out. No one sat down and designed a capitalist system before it came into being. And it is amazing to me how many people don't listen to Marx about trying to do that with socialism. Because Marx is explicit about that. That's his main critique of the utopian socialists. And yet we're always trying to to prefigure it with goals beyond, say, a relatively modest minimum program. And if people don't believe me and it's relatively modest, go back and read the Communist Manifesto. The program is specific and fairly modest for its time period. It's also, its reasoning and its orientation is absolutely ambitious, though, and that's something I think people need to.
I mean, we might disagree a little bit here.
Okay.
Or perhaps we could just deepen this a little bit. I would say that the bourgeoisie, theorizes bourgeois society in the not prior to it. That you're absolutely right about that. So, again, let's just rely on Marx for this. He has his critique of political economy. He says the first political economy is Sir William Petty, right? In other words, sometime in the 1650s, 1660s, 1670s, it's emerging out of the English Civil War and the Restoration period, and it's more or less full blown with like Sir Dudley North and the others in the era of the Glorious Revolution, 1689 and beyond. Similarly, of course, you could make a parallel argument about the rise of modern philosophy with Descartes in the middle of the 16th century, middle of the 17th century, Hobbes, Descartes, etc. It's in the wake of the emergence of bourgeois society and the very deep history of bourgeois society, right? Which goes back into the Reformation, at least, really goes back into the Renaissance. So the owl of Minerva flies at dusk. The bourgeoisie only becomes conscious of itself in the wake of deep social transformations. But what we call the Enlightenment, I would say, certainly the high Enlightenment, like Rousseau and after, Rousseau, Smith, Kant, Hegel, Jefferson, these people, they are self-conscious of the crisis of bourgeois society, right? That bourgeois society, bourgeois revolution, in order to be advanced, has to be thought about, right? That we're not going to crab walk into the future, right? That the English Revolution is not about creating a righteous Christian society. It's about creating a commercial society. This is what Adam Smith is saying, right? What he means by mercantilism is the inadequate old bourgeois thought, really. He calls John Locke a mercantilist. He obviously respects John Locke as a great revolutionary. They're thinkers of the crisis of bourgeois society in the 18th century, which is not capitalism. It's not like provoked by the Industrial Revolution, right? It's just, it's the possibility that bourgeois revolution can fall into absolutism, really. And so the issue in that period is, what's hard for people to understand is that something like Adam Smith or Kant or Hegel, what they're really thinking about is, what is this new freedom? That's the whole topic of enlightenment. That's why Hegel just comes along and says, philosophy is the science of freedom. Everything else is something else, right? But what we're doing is, what philosophy is freedom reflecting on itself, right? In order to advance itself. Now, the bourgeois thinkers are funny because they can also say it's providential. Freedom happens occurs behind our backs. Like, that's not a problem for them. Exactly. They can kind of say both. We have to think, we have to debate in public, we have to exercise public reason, and we have to clarify our ideas. And the owl of Minerva will fly at dusk, and history and freedom will take placed behind our backs, and there's a cunning of reason, right? Both of those things are part of the way that they think about the dialectic of theory and practice. For Marx, that problem becomes different, right? And that, without going into any, long-winded discussion of it, and you and Reed, I think, said a lot about that at the level of what it means to talk about the properly Marxian dialectic, which is about the crisis of the bourgeois dialectic of theory and practice. It's an immanent dialectical critique of that dialectic. That's really the lesson driven home by the failure of the Revolution of 1848. Like, politically, what it looks like, world historically, what the crisis of bourgeois society under capitalism looks like, is that bourgeois social forms stop spreading. That the characteristic expression of bourgeois society is not wealth but poverty. For instance, in places like India that Marx writes about, the misery of the Hindu is that the old world is destroyed and no new world is put in its place. The same thing happened. Why doesn't the modern revolution spread into Germany? It had occurred in Holland. It had occurred in England. It had occurred in America. It had occurred in France. Here in 1848 is Europe's moment. Germany, Italy, Poland, all of these countries, right? Why can't there be a bourgeois revolution here? Why is of course, the French Revolution failed, but why does the failure of this revolution feel like the rise of the authoritarian state? It feels like something other than mere reaction and restoration, right? That's like politically what, Marx is thinking. That's what the problem of capital looks like. It looks like democratic reaction, right? Which just would make no sense in the past, or it'd be like the rabble or the mob, some kind of neo-Republican idea.
Well, it's interesting because I think about where we are right now, and we are probably looking at various forms of democratic reaction. And I have taken a stance for a long time.
Probably.
Right. That
our comrades on the left, God damn it.
I had taken a stance for the long time that that reaction in the cores of capital are bipartisan and and also I think we might have disagreements on for example, the republicanism of the right now. I think you have pointed out that they still talk in terms of rights, and I have always said they do until they don't, and they actually kind of remind me of the French bourgeoisie in that sense. Like, the moment they hit a hard part, they throw all those things out the window. The more interesting thing about this, though, is the belief in an administrative state and the belief in the bourgeois state as a actor of social maintenance and progress has been so inculcated on the left that even anarchists have it. It's actually, that's quite strange to me, because I'm always like, how do you, like, why? The logic of what you're saying at best would be abstention, if not totally insurrectionary. But yet, I don't know, why are so many people from Graeber to Chomsky advocating strategic voting for a state that they don't really believe in, and stuff like that. I think that brings me to this is something that's made.
Can I just defend myself for 30 seconds?
Go ahead.
Which is that I'm not going to defend the Republican Party. I only point all of these things out as a way of checking your watch, a way of keeping up with history and like understanding that things are still moving and that there are political reversals and dynamics, that just saying things like the Republicans are for the free market and the Democrats are for the welfare state or something. It's like, yeah, but look at this radical change around like the question of rights, right? How do you fit that into your lesser evil narrative? But I completely agree with you. I'm not going to leave it up to Ted Cruz to defend my rights.
Right. Well, I think I guess I was disagreeing with you for a chance to point that out, because that is the caricature of yours and Chris's thought, is that ultimately it tails the right. And I do think there are people under the name of Marx who are actually tailing the right. I don't think that's
it's a funny thing, right? This whole compact magazine stuff, like all of this, like, yeah, it's really weird world we're in.
Right, and they're telling what they're telling in the right.
I don't know if it's about Marx, but it's about socialism.
It's about socialism, but it's the aristocratic reaction to bourgeois republicanism that they're telling, as manifesting in a national conservatism that is a tradition that goes back to the aristocratic reaction to bourgeois revolutions, in my mind. That, with some concessions to popular democracy, but very few. That somehow socialists have been able to convince themselves is...
You're saying it's a kind of red Toryism.
Yeah, basically.
Yep.
Almost explicitly, and it's also explicitly religious. Like, although not in a way that American leftists would understand, because American leftists are obsessed with evangelicals, so high Catholic and Orthodox religious thinkers like confuse them in some fundamental way. But one theory that I have come reluctantly to agree with you on, and if you go back and listen to not the show that I do now, but the show I used to do with Doug Lane, Pop the Left, where you can hear me souring on this, is that I became convinced around 2016, actually with the first failure of the Bernie campaign, which I was a skeptic of, but a very quiet skeptic of. That I've
heard you talk about this a lot, This is Revolution and with Gene. On your show.
That the millennial left has actually been kind of the shock troop for the party of order, and the party of order is actually the Democrats, not the Republicans.
And what a fall was there, right? In the sense that, there really was, you'll always hear me, remark the fact that, your generation is like a generation in a way that, mine isn't. There's a reason why it's Generation X, like whatever, like we don't know what these kids are. And we had no consciousness of ourselves as a generation. We weren't politically constituted as a generation in the way that you guys were. And something like Jacobin is a high expression of that, Jacobin magazine.
Right.
And, you will remember, this, it goes back to this thing that I was saying before about the party question, right? And really rethinking socialism. I mean, this was a part of it. Bhaskar Sankara was an admirer of Mike McNair in the CPGB and around this neo-Kautskian thinking. And, neo-Kautskianism, and then this led on to the, what's become this weird, like, I guess I guess people call it like based or something. Like based leftism is to know a hell of a lot about Eugene Debs, right? Like to me, like knowing about Eugene Debs is like knowing your fucking history, right? Knowing about the American socialist tradition is like it wasn't particularly sexy because the left wasn't sexy, but you learned it if you want to know what you were talking about. And whether in Germany or in the United States, it was about class independence. It was. That's what Marxism really meant, and it was not foreign to parties where Marxism was not a dominant trend. It was part of a wider inheritance of socialism, and the flip on that, right, from a long-term project of building socialism in opposition to the prevailing capitalist politics through civil society. I know that sounds very mystical to people, but the study of history, is the only way to understand what I'm talking about. That you could have a politics that wasn't about administering the capitalist state. In that sense, it wasn't about becoming president. Until it might become that, but becoming president would mean instituting the dictatorship of the proletariat. It wouldn't mean like administering this thing. This generation of young people has become very demoralized, and the full consequences of the Bernie campaign, it really can only be understood to me, and this is where people freak out about, Chris and me, is, that we didn't follow the line on Trump. But to me, it was the anti-Trump hysteria that followed on the Bernie campaign that confirmed hundreds of thousands, millions of young idealistic people becoming Democrats. Right. It was Russiagate. Like when you get fooled and duped like that, you are a full member of the party. That's the initiation right. That's the hazing that the Democrats demand of you, is right. the total surrender of your reason, right? And, that's what happened through the Trump years. It's not that Trump is going to do anything. It's just that he isn't what they're saying. It's just another capitalist politician. Is he better than Reagan or Bush or, W. Bush or baby Bush? You could make that argument any number of ways, but it's not like out of left field. It's not, fascism or whatever. What people were freaking out about, and to my mind, what sort of underlay the hysteria was a sense of helplessness in the face of historical change, right? What you get by the time of Sanders and Trump is a late, 8 years after the market crash of 2008, full political registration of the crisis of neoliberalism.
Yeah, agreed.
And and at that point, the game was up. The left, history glanced at the left for 1 second and said, "Are you prepared to lead society through this crisis?" Obviously not. Next, right? And it was because of the shamefacedness of the left, like, "Oh yeah, we are not prepared," right? What did we do? Where did we miss the opportunity? What was the time, right? Mm-hmm. That moment of being swept up in helplessness, right? And looking to, and that's the problem with thinking that it was Bernie Sanders' choice to run for president that created the left. No.
Absolutely not.
Yeah, this is like the scale of like the, you know, I know that people hate historians for like bitching about like periodization and how to think about swaths of time. It really matters, right? And this is where you see it, right? Because people were prepared enough by the previous 10 years to be conscious of their helplessness.
Right.
And that's so psychically intolerable that that's what we're seeing play out now as like, I just want to talk about basketball. You know, I just want to, you know, just the demoralization, depoliticization.
Well, you see the same depoliticization of the millennial left that you did of the boomer left. Honestly, like the new left into the the culture of narcissism, which is, you know, I'm a Lash scholar as well as a Marx scholar these days, and I see the parallels being profound, and yet I also am like, if you're afraid of reaction and you're literally, I mean, I know leftists who literally think they're going to be put in the camps, and I'm like, and yet you also think you have broad-based popular support to be passively reacting to a spectacle like this doesn't make any sense. So you either don't believe what you're saying, or you do, but you're totally disempowered and you've done it to yourself. You know, those are both options. There might be other options. I don't want to put everything in a binary like that, but it seems to me that that's where a lot of people are, where I'm like, no, we have to kind of forgo it alone. Rebuilding that, like, I have a lot of friends that work with, you know, and Jacobin stuff, but I'm going to just say this outright.
Sure.
Bhaskar Sankara becoming the president of the Nations Foundation was, to me, the symbolism that this millennial left had become, like the boomers before them, the establishment that they were opposing. But unlike some of the boomers before them, although I maybe I'm being unfair here because I wasn't alive then, they are not owning the fact that they are, because they'll complain about Biden, they'll complain about this and that, but I'm like, you are how this happened. You in specific are how this happened. You gave the momentum. You made it seem like there was a counter momentum and that Trump was that dangerous even to the people in the suburbs. And yet, none of the conditions under Trump that you complained about have been ameliorated or addressed at all. And you've basically made it to where larger civil society is like, so what? Like, was it really that bad? And if you really believe that democracy is at stake, then your actions make no sense. You either don't really believe it, or you do, but you've totally pacified yourself. So, which is my way of saying is you defeated yourself. Like, you killed your own political agency. And that,
I think that there's I don't want to comment too much on all of that. I mean, I just think that, I would say this, you know, which is that the one thing that I, you know, what I would say about sort of Jacobin DSA, you know, is they didn't defeat the other leftist project. You know, that's the thing. Right, is that it's left us. It's hard to. On what basis do we criticize them? Right. You know, in other words, like, you know, maybe Bhaskar himself is learning the same lessons. You know, he didn't defeat my socialist party. Right. And so, like, I'm not here to say, like, see, I told you so. And we had this alternative project.
correct.
Right? I'm not here to say that. What I will say is that I think that there's an intimacy in the relationship between the generations of defeat that has to be thought through, right? There's a way in which the 30s is reproduced in the 60s, is reproduced in the 2000s, zeros and tens, right? And it's that question. You had Daniel Bessner on to talk about imperialism on another podcast, in your back catalog. People should listen to it. It was good. And he says, well, the thing about socialism is it died in 1914 there. And, that's a goddamn sobering thought that I think, makes you think about how, I feel like, a lot of I don't even know if we experience social reality exactly. It's like, it's like shadow boxing. It's like chasing after ghosts. I don't know what the social problems of our time exactly are, because even to the degree that I feel like the 60s or the New Left generation constituted them, because I feel like the millennial left never quite broke out of the kind of repetition of the New Left. They never quite broke out of the shadow of the boomers. And so it was like racism and gender. And I'm like, are we experiencing this now? Or are we still like in this, or is this about like, are we overcoming Jim Crow? Right? Is this the Black Panthers? Like, do we experience this as it exists in our society now? Right? Where like, it's fine. Where it's like about, I guess like race is about like pornography choices or something. People like to see like, it's very unclear what society is and what we really are talking about. We consume race like in a certain way, but is it racism? It's like when I get into arguments where I'll say to people, the Democrats are more racist than the Republicans. And I'll argue that point just to tweak their minds a little bit, to get them to think about what does it mean to organize politics demographically like this? Aren't the Republicans sincere when they make the claim that they're making a universal appeal? The Trumps, what do you got to lose? Kind of thing. I feel like the failure of the millennial left, and of course it failed with an old boomer at its head, Bernie Sanders. The ironies of it all, make me want to think not just about the arc of the millennial left and of its defeat, but also of the intergenerational transmission of defeat, of the multiple kind of compounding of defeat, right? And that's where, my real one problem with the Democrat leftists is they won't let me think it out loud, right? They want to stifle the intellectual debate of confronting the crisis. And I'm not blaming Bhaskar. I've never heard Bhaskar kind of say anything like,
Jacobin doesn't do that explicitly, but the culture of the left is exclusionary, which I don't think people realize actually, and it's exclusionary in ways that also assumes that because it speaks for people that those people have its back. And for example, the whole study after study being like, yeah, these minority groups that you have based your entire political projection of like hegemony on are abandoning you too, and that you can't just always pretend that your political enemies are just old cishet white dudes. And like when I literally have conversations on this channel where when I point that out, people, they almost can't respond to me. They don't denounce me, but they just like, because I have hard stats now. It's like, it's not just in 2019, this was a suspicion that I had. In 2022, I have hard numbers, and so it's just like it's interesting to watch, and then to argue that you assumed the demographics was destiny, and then you're surprised when people believe the Great Replacement theory, which is a bullshit conspiracy, but it's a bullshit conspiracy that you actually kind of argued 10 years ago as a positive. Like,
yeah, it's just the same argument. It's just it's the same argument from two sides,
Like I could literally pull up a Tim Wise article from 2010 and just be like,
don't like, pull up a Tim Wise article from 2010,
like,
please.
Do you see a direct relationship here between what the people you think are regenerate racist are saying and what was said in 2011? The thing is, this is wrong, but it's because this was wrong too. Right. And the I think, and one of the reasons why I think there are so many thought taboos around this stuff is actually negating responsibility for this. Like, it's not like, I don't think it's about I don't think it's just about like protecting endangered groups or whatever. I think it is also so no one says like, you transparently
protecting endangered groups. I love that. Let's build like a forest preserve.
Right.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, but the whole like, you transparently failed. Like, I mean, even on this rise of the quote reactionary right thing, right? If Biden was supposed to prevent that by removing Trump, every social indication as of right now today says that you failed so bad that with the election of Biden and with the way things have gone, that for a lot of people, despite the fact that they agreed with you 2 years ago, Trump seems like a better option, or something like Trump, even if it's not Trump himself. And and by the way,
I mean, just the scale of the political impasse today is unreal. That I'm shocked that I guess one thing that I liked about Trump was that he advanced a crisis in the Republican Party. The concentration of stagnancy or powerlessness or impotency or the inability to move one direction or another in the Democratic Party right now. I mean, it's just, I've never seen anything like it, and obviously Biden's age is a kind of metaphor for it, but it goes well beyond that. I mean, they really had to lead one way or another. And the reason they didn't, again, is because of this anti-Trump bullshit. Right, by treating Trump as a fascist rather than simply as an expression of a crisis in the opposition party, which I'm not sure was to the right of the old I'm not sure that Trump is to the right of Paul Ryan. It's very different for sure. It's a new form of right-wing politics, right. But the Democrats needed to generate a new form of right-wing politics, to match it, and they're just abdicating in the gridlock, just watching the entire constitutional order of the United States, the party political order of the United States, just gridlock right now under the, really under the, because the Democrats are the ruling party.
Right.
The Democrats have to lead. The Republicans are never really responsible. Like this idea that we're going to have like a Republican Congress and a Republican Senate and all kinds of Republican state houses and maybe a Republican president in 2024. And I'm like, these people have, because Trump lost in 2020, they are going to not resolve their crisis and they're going to be hamstrung. And it just is, there's a way in which, this post-neoliberal order, and this gets back to the question of the millennial left, is just utterly opaque. it's not taking on a kind of clear political constitution.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to have you back on with your co-author on India, and we'll be talking about this in a more global scale and looking at the Indian situation, which I think is more is more instructive in a lot of ways than people would probably want it to be. Thank you so much for coming on. Anything you'd like to plug other than the book?
No, just you introduced me as the editor of Sublation Magazine. I'm also, so go see that, Sublation Mag. And of course, I'm an ongoing active member of the Platypus Affiliated Society. Check out the Platypus Review at platypus1917.org. I really appreciate your thoughtful questions, Derick. This was good fun.
All right, thank you. It was nice to talk to you. I will say, as an ex-platypi or platypode, whatever, that one of the most useful things I ever got out of there was your contextualization of Trotskyism, which I think you did in 2012 or 13, long time ago now, almost a decade ago, but very helpful for me, and I still go back to it. So
I have no idea what I said.
Yeah, it was well, it was just it actually, I had puzzled over the weird tendencies of the New Left for a long time, and it gave it a context, at least, which is something that I did not have even from reading the histories of those movements, because most of the people in them were in them, and they were also trying to win.
And they assumed the context, yeah.
Yeah, they assumed the context. So if I can remember the title, I'll tell people specifically to check it out, because I know it's available on the website. But anyway.
Yeah, send it to me. It's always curious to me to see what the hell I was carrying on about.
Yeah,
that I've probably completely forgotten. Yeah.
All right.
Once again, thanks so much. Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.